Welcome back to class. In this session, we're going to look at the major themes of chapters 4 and 5 of Daniel Yergin's The Prize. At the end of chapter 2, we were left with John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil in supreme monopolistic control of the American oil economy. Chapters 4 and 5 describe the changes in the oil economy that led ultimately to the breakup of Standard Oil and a fundamentally different structure of the American oil economy as we head into the world wars. Yergin opens chapter 4 by describing the invention of the electric light bulb. And surely there are few inventions that have so profoundly transformed human civilization. The electric light bulb is ultimately going to allow us to become a 24/7, 365 days a year society, right? And especially in terms of our economic productivity. And ultimately, of course, it's the capturing of the light rays and to be able to produce them through electric impulse that will be the foundation of the computer revolution and really lead to the doorstep of contemporary technology. Much like George Bissell experimenting in his laboratory with a little hunk of Seneca rock oil, the actual science of the development of the electric light bulb seems comparatively simple in retrospect, right? The key development here, the key idea is that we're going to charge up an electric wire with electricity. We're going to run that through a heavy wire that can easily carry the voltage or the wattage, and then we're going to enter it into a thin wire that's essentially going to burn. Right, it's going to light red and get heated before it transfers back and the current is carried back to its source of generation. And that lighting on fire or burning is going to emit a light. The search here is really for the right kind of metal thread or filament that will carry that charge. Of course, you want it to light up with a color that you can see with. A lot of metal will light up dark red, and you can't use that for an illuminant. And of course, the other side is you don't want it to light on fire and burn out like a modern fuse. And so really the two elements of Edison's great genius was the discovery of a kind of tungsten alloy, right? That would be the appropriate metal. And then at what constant voltage or wattage should the electrical current be pumped through that filament to produce exactly the spectrum of light that's most conducive to reading and work and normal human vision. Edison's most important patents are in the late 1880s into the early 1890s, so there's a kind of working model. But it's really important not to exaggerate the immediacy of sort of the impact of the light bulb. That is, say, everyone immediately recognizes what a revolutionary technology this will be, but it's going to take a very long time to build out the electric grid to bring a significant number of people, to bring electric light to a significant number of people. You may be familiar with the story of the competition between Edison and Tesla for AC and DC current, and in the competing cities, New York City and Chicago, as they tried to implement the different grid systems. Electricity is really only going to be available in the biggest cities in the downtown districts for the first several decades. You won't even really have urban residential electricity until the 1920s, and we won't have anything like a mass electric grid until after World War II, really with the building of the suburbs and hardwiring those suburbs when they're built onto electric grids. So the invention of the light bulb is profound and dramatic. You just want to think about it's really going to take about a half a century to roll it out, where there's a kind of mass everyday experience of living with light bulbs. For its first phase, electric light is going to come to commercial districts in big cities, and factories and kind of production centers are going to be able to light their campuses for the factory workers to be able to work after dark. The Significance for Jurgen, of course, is that the electric light bulb is eventually going to spell the doom of the kerosene lamp and the kerosene market, and it may have been that petroleum headed along a very different trajectory if it weren't for a couple of other inventions that happened almost simultaneously with the light bulb. Those two key inventions are the internal combustion engine and the electric motor, and especially attaching those two things together. We're all familiar with cars and automobiles. In many ways, the automobile defines as the icon of the 20th century, and we will track in future sessions the development of global auto production, fuel consumption, emissions, and all the rest. The key developments for the internal combustion engine occur from the mid-1880s to the mid-1890s, and this is one aspect of the story where European developments are equally important to American developments. The Germans and the French are making automobiles, the early automobiles, right along with American developers. The key kind of technological breakthrough for the internal combustion engine is the development of high-strength steel alloys, right, that can be very finely machined with very fine tolerances that can withstand the heat, right? You're creating, think of the Watt and Bolton steam steam engine, right? You're creating very small canisters for that explosion of energy to take place in, and containing that and channeling that into mechanical levers. And so it's really about the strength of the metal and the ability to very finely machine that metal with very close tolerances that allow for the development of the internal combustion engine. Jurgen tells you that there are just shy of 1 million cars on the road in America on the cusp of World War I. I think he tells you 900,000. They really are, for the most part, play items of the rich. Up until World War I, and we'll come back, it's really in the 1920s that cars become mass-produced items designed for working class people, the Model T for $500 and whatnot, and we'll come back to that. Equally important is the development of the diesel engine or the diesel motor, and you can track the transition, especially looking at images of ships from this period. Of course, there's no airline travel. The major modes of transportation for anything heavy, any kind of heavy commodities, overland is train. By the second half of the 19th century, and of course for centuries it has been ship. For 100 years or so, or 75 years or so, the great ships of the Atlantic and the Pacific, you would see those giant smokestacks right in the middle of them, billowing out smoke. That's the steam engines, right? And the kind of mark of the transition to the modern diesel-electric motor-driven ships is the absence of that big smokestack that you see in the image in the lower right. Attaching a diesel a diesel engine to an electric motor allows you to apply mechanical pressure, right? So these ships and also the trains that you see at the bottom are being primarily operated by electric motors applying mechanical pressure. The image on the lower left shows a diesel electric generator, right? So you're running a diesel motor, it's attached to an electric generator at the end there, and these diesel electric generators are at least as impactful for spreading the grid as the development of kind of central power stations in towns. That is to say, lots of factories that are built on large complexes, right, where you have multiple factory buildings, especially in the auto industry and the steel industry and affiliated industries, will build little power plants on their own campus, stock them with, half a dozen or a dozen of these diesel electric generators, and those will be kind of mushrooming little power grids. So they'll power the factory campus, and not unlikely when they get up and running, if they're generating excess electricity, they'll run a cable across the street and power a little downtown district. Maybe there'll be a bar, a restaurant, a bank, and a pharmacy or something, general store or something like that, and slowly then the residential areas closest to those downtown commercial districts might get electricity into their houses. So the kind of standalone independent diesel electric generator is probably equally impactful because it is only large factories that have the kind of capital to be able to devote to building this kind of infrastructure. But both of these things, gasoline internal combustion engines and diesel electric configurations, are going to mean the revival of the oil industry as it was facing sort of certain doom with the invention of the electric light bulb. The second big change that Jurgen describes in Chapter 4 is the diversification of production regions in the United States. For the first 30 or 40 years, the history of oil in America, it really is a story about northwest Pennsylvania, and as they follow discoveries down kind of the west slope of the mountains into northern Ohio, right? So it is largely a northeastern story. Starting in the early 1890s, oil is discovered in the mountains north of Los Angeles, the Ventura Mountains. If you have visited Los Angeles or are sort of familiar with it from all the movies and TV shows that have been made about it, you may understand Los Angeles sits in a kind of basin, a kind of low plateau with a hard geologic surface to it, and it is ringed by mountains on three sides, and by the ocean, of course, on the west side. The first discoveries in Southern California are in the mountains north of Los Angeles, and very quickly by the end of the decade, prospectors follow those veins and pools down into the center of that basin. Downtown Los Angeles, with all of the skyscrapers and freeways and everything, is built on top of a depleted oil field. The basic geology then is very, very similar to the geology of northwest Pennsylvania. That is to say, they're still looking for cracks in mountains where asphalt tar is oozing out, and looking around at sort of valleys nearby where they can set up their oil rigs. But what is really fascinating, of course, about California is that it has indeed been a state for some 40 years and is fully integrated, if you will, sort of legally and politically within the United States. The West Coast is very separate from the East Coast at this point in American history. It still is in a lot of ways, but certainly back in this period where you really just have railroad lines, a handful of railroad lines connecting the East and the West Coast, and of course the Panama Canal by the 1890s. But there's a whole distinct group of robber barons, monopolists, if you will, the great men of early California history, guys like Samuel Huntington or Lemuel Stanford. You may recognize those names. Are the equivalent of Rockefeller and Vanderbilt and Carnegie and whatnot on the East Coast. So the development of the oil industry in California is going to open up a whole new set of markets, require its own independent refinery system, transportation system, et cetera, et cetera. It's not simply additional oil, but it is a whole new region of the country that is going to come into production and require all the same apparatuses that were constructed on the East Coast. Now, Standard Oil is going to come west and do its very best to buy up as many of the producers as it can, and do its very best to monopolize the refining industry on the West Coast in the way that it had on the East Coast. But they're going to enter into competition with the great capital resources of the West Coast. And so Standard Oil is not going to be able to impose the same kind of monopoly on production in California that they were able to do in the previous 40 years on the East Coast. Standard Oil will create Standard Oil of California, CalSO, and as we follow these oil companies through the remainder of the semester, CalSO is going to become Chevron. All of the independent producers in California, or a great many of them, cooperate together, they unionize, and we're going to talk more in just a minute about the kind of radical leftist politics of the late 19th century and early 20th century, and the rise of unions are a big part of that. And so all the independent producers cooperate together to keep competition. They call themselves Union Oil, or what will become Unocal. And you may have seen that emblem if you're into car racing, or have seen ads about car racing on TV. That 76 is a very significant logo, right? It's a harkening back to 1776 in the spirit of the revolution. And so Unocal has always been the scrappy independent fighting against the big monopolists. It's sort of an important part of its cultural identity. The rise of the Californian independents under Union Oil is the first sort of crack in Standard Oil's monopoly. This first crack in Standard Oil's dominance of the American oil industry, created by the oil discoveries in Southern California, is going to become a series of fissures and ultimately a giant rift or schism in the American oil industry, with the discovery of oil in East Texas beginning in the mid-1890s. Jurgen tells you the wonderful story of crazy Patio Higgins out there wandering the grassy plains of East Texas with his kind of oil witching stick, and his neighbors think he's crazy, right? But Higgins has this idea, this intuition that there might be oil beneath those rolling plains. One of the most significant things about the discovery of oil in Texas is this is not the classic coal mountain geology that prospectors have been following for the previous half century. There are no mountains in Texas, of course. Right? No one expects there to be oil beneath these grassy plains. But what Higgins has the first intuition of is that if you go back to our first class session, I showed you that image of the classic salt dome bubble, right? The sealed rock layer over the top, the source of lignite beneath it. That lignite under pressure is releasing oil and gas and water, and so that mound or that dome is under pressure. We are going to come to associate that as the classic oil gusher discovery, right? It was not really until Patio Higgins in the mid-1890s in Texas that became the dominant image, or the kind of the geologic structure that explorers were searching for. Because that structure is under pressure, these Texas oil wells are going to produce at a rate that is astronomical by anything that has preceded it. When Spindletop bursts in 1901, it's going to gush at 75,000 barrels per day. There has been nothing like this in the previous half century of oil prospecting. Just a few years later, in 1905, the Glen Pool gusher is going to burst in Oklahoma, just outside of Tulsa. That is going to send prospectors up and down this coastal plain and east into Louisiana, and there's going to be a series of discoveries that's going to make Texas, or we refer to as either the Gulf Coast or Texas oil, by far the largest oil producing region in the entire world. Really until the 1950s and the 1960s, with the discovery of Middle East oil, the great Saudi and Kuwaiti and Iraqi and Iranian deposits, Texas oil, or Gulf Coast oil, is going to be the largest source of oil in the entire world. This is going to create an opportunity for a number of independent companies to enter into the market and become very substantial players, and for Standard Oil to be comparatively a minor player in this region. So whereas in California you sort of have Standard Oil and everybody else has to cartel together to be big enough to stand up against Standard Oil, the Gulf Coast creates an entirely different business environment. each one of these players, and kind of the majority of Chapter 4, Jurgen devotes to telling you the story of the origins of each one of these Gulf Coast companies. Each one of these companies is going to play a unique role in creating kind of a second independent and parallel sector of the American oil industry. From the development of the Gulf Coast independence, we're going to sort of have East Coast New York oil, the Manhattan companies, right? And we have an image of guys in three-piece suits and stockbrokers sitting in Manhattan offices. That's the kind of classic Standard Oil image. And then we're going to have all these independent companies, these sort of Texas cowboys, right? Today, largely centered around Houston, but had several independent locations in the early stages of their development. So the first three that Jurgen tells you about are all have their roots in Pennsylvania, were sort of significant players in the East Coast oil industry, and came down to Texas to make their play and emerge with their own independent foundation. So the story of Pure Oil, these guys Guffey and Gale, they sort of are the semi-con artists that come in and hook up with Petit O'Higgins and get legal title to his discovery. Now they're a small operation. Because they have the first foot in the door, they're able to get a foundation, but they're still going to be shut out of East Coast retail markets, right? Rockefeller and Standard Oil are not going to let Guffey and Gale or Pure Oil, Guffey Oil down in Texas, sell their oil to East Coast markets. So they need a partner. And enter Shell Gasoline. And the significance of Shell Gasoline is that it is a British and Dutch company. We'll talk more about the origins of Shell in the next class session. But because Guffey and Gale need a place to sell their oil, they're the first American company. Well, Standard Oil is already in Europe as a kerosene company, but the first independent American company to reach out for a European partner. So this is very significant in sort of connecting Texas oil with international markets. The Mellons are a banking family in Pennsylvania, largely based in Pittsburgh, but of course have investments all over the East Coast. The Mellons come down and they establish Gulf Oil. They do have some leases and some oil production claims, but the main focus of the Mellons and Gulf Oil is to build the pipeline and refinery system. They are, if you will, they're trying to replicate Rockefeller's initial insight back in the 1870s to buy up all the refineries in Cleveland. Well, there are no existing or very few independent refineries when the Mellons get their foot in the door in Texas. But there is going to become the most technologically advanced pipeline system in the world that's going to ultimately connect these fields in Oklahoma, the fields in Louisiana, and when West Texas starts hitting in the 1920s, the most vast and technologically advanced pipeline system in the world is going to connect all of those fields with Port Arthur. And Port Arthur is going to become the center of refining for all of this Gulf Coast oil. So the Mellons really have a lock on the pipeline and refinery aspect of Gulf Coast oil. The Pews are the New York money that backs Sun Oil in the Pennsylvania fields, or with their Pennsylvania claims. They're going to come down to Texas and turn themselves into Sunoco, that is the Sun Oil Company abbreviated. They're going to have a variety of claims. Their foundation really is going to be a little bit later, their expansion, when we start talking about Mexico oil and Venezuela oil. The Pews, based in Beaumont, are going to become very important in that sector. And finally, Tom Cullinan of Houston. And we love Tom Cullinan because he is not an East Coaster. He's a native Texan. And so he really does represent, and the Texaco brand represent the independent, the mountain plainsman who hates the East Coast, the fancy three-piece suited businessman of the East Coast. He's a real cowboy, this Cullinan. And Texaco will both become the major developer of the West Texas oil when it starts hitting, and it is the most important American company when the Mexico oil industry strikes, largely in the late 1920s. From this moment, the American oil industry is always going to have this kind of bifurcated culture, right? We've got the rich Manhattanites trading their oil shares on the stock market in New York, and then you've got these cowboy-booted plainsmen out here, these roughnecks, these independents down in the Gulf Coast. That bifurcation is going to have a profound impact if the development of governmental policy around the oil industry. We're going to talk a lot more about that in the post-World War II period, but we're always going to treat these independent companies very differently than we treat those New York boys. Now, the New York boys, the kind of descendants of Standard Oil, as we'll see, are going to be far more international, and they're going to take the lead when American companies are going into the Gulf Coast and Southeast Asia. It will be primarily those New York companies and occasionally partnering with some of these Gulf Coast independents. So this emergence of Texas oil, not only for the kind of glut of oil that it produces in the American economy and all the technological innovations, the development of the automobile and the diesel engine, as we've said, is going to have a profound impact going forward. Chapter 4 then is devoted to describing these kind of tectonic changes in the American oil industry on the side of consumption with the development of new technologies, and also on the side of production with the opening up of new regions and the emergence of independent companies. In Chapter 5, then, Juergen is going to turn to law and politics, and Chapter 5 is going to culminate with the breaking up of Standard Oil by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1911. Juergen begins Chapter 5 by explaining the emergence of a new corporate form called the holding company, first established by the state legislature in New Jersey in 1899. The key idea of a holding company, if you think back to our discussion of the trust in our previous session, the key idea of the trust is that it is this legal fiction, right? They stole this idea, this legal mechanism that had been created to help widows and orphans, right, and other legal dependents, that what the trust did was create this legal fiction that the trust could control and manage assets in different states without actually owning them, because to outright own those assets, they would have to be incorporated in multiple different states. So the key idea of the trust is this controlling or managing without outright owning. Well, the key development of the holding company is that it permits a corporation to outright own assets in a variety of states. It will become the standard organizational form for American corporations for the next century or more. And it allows this other kind of fiction. So a holding company is incorporated in the state of New Jersey. It owns assets throughout the country. So it appears to be a kind of national company. So in the image on the lower left, the kind of generic diagram of a holding company with the title Federated National Holding Company, right? It has the appearance of being a national company when in fact it is created by a single state. It's going to be another 30 years really before the development of the SEC, the Security and Exchange Commission, and the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, and the other agencies developed during the New Deal period, before the federal government will really have substantive regulatory authority over these corporations. So it really formalizes that in-between state of these national companies. That is, they're sort of beyond the scale of any one state to regulate, but they're still not subject to any really meaningful federal authority, at least for the first, say, third of the 20th century. Now, many states are going to start authorizing holding companies, and there'll be a kind of competition among the states to create the friendliest environment to corporations to try to encourage as many to establish themselves in their state as possible. And you may be aware that today, in the beginning of the 21st century, that the vast majority of American companies are in fact incorporated in the state of Delaware. Delaware has for a very long time had the friendliest incorporation laws, and it's just sort of a thing about American companies that a great many of them are incorporated in the state of Delaware. Holding companies then formalize and legitimize the concentration of economic power in a handful of people, even a single company, for different sectors of the economy. They had developed, up until the emergence of the holding company, trusts for a whole variety of different commodities. So there was a copper trust and a steel trust and the railroad trust and a banking trust, etc., etc. And of course the oil trust under Standard Oil. With the emergence of the holding company, those different trusts are able to finally incorporate themselves. But at the very moment of sort of the pinnacle of their success, that is to say the hard structuring of the American economy around this model, the leaders of these different trusts or corporations became increasingly the object of political reaction. You are hopefully familiar with the term the robber barons. And of course, the most infamous of all the robber barons was John D. Rockefeller, who was the kingpin at the head of Standard Oil. Andrew Carnegie and Cornelius Vanderbilt and J.P. Morgan and a whole variety of others, Bill Pullman, right, were each comparable to Rockefeller in charge of a particular sector of the American economy. As their kind of celebrity and renown, as they become more legitimized and formalized through things, legal changes like the holding company, they also become the face of the kind of inequities and exploitation of this kind of economy. Jürgen describes the muckraking journalism that became very popular right around the turn of the century, that, if you will, publish sort of investigative exposés on these different monopolies and trusts. So you may have heard of Upton Sinclair's famous book, The Jungle, which was an investigation of the meatpacking industry. And Jürgen spends a little bit of time here in Chapter 5 describing Ida Tarbell and her famous book, The History of Standard Oil. The plight of the worker, the factory worker, and the urban underclass becomes a kind of popular motif for works, both of kind of newspaper works and magazine reporting, which is a very common in the period, and also the publication of books such as Lincoln Steffen's The Shame of the Cities or Jacob Riis' How the Other Half Lives. The problem of urban poverty and the exploitation of the factory or kind of proletarian working class becomes a central object of American public culture. Muckraking journalism and a kind of culture of exposés of the dirty workings of these trusts coincided with a period of really radical politics and people organizing in protest of the power of the trusts. In some aspects of this politics were sort of leftist, socialist, even communist, with the organization of industrial unions. But it's also really important to keep in mind there was a whole parallel strain of radical politics, which you could describe as kind of rural, agrarian, even reactionary, in the Farmers' Alliances and the Grange movement, if you're familiar with the Grange movement, a kind of panoply of independent political parties that we call broadly people's parties, right? And that phrase, the people's parties, describes a whole range of kind of ideological or policy platform positions, from the most radical lefties who really are inspired by European developments and Marxism and communism at the period, the IWW being among the most radical of them. But there's this whole kind of parallel agrarian that's really based in the plain states from Texas up through Kansas and Nebraska that are largely protesting the exploitative relationship between farmers and the railroads, because of course farmers across the Midwest and the Mississippi River Valley are dependent upon the railroads to get their commodities to market, and the railroads apply the same kind of pressure to farmers that we've seen Rockefeller use the railroads to apply pressure to refiners and competing oil producers. This system of the trusts, or the system of the robber barons, transcends different sectors of the American economy. And in the 1880s and the 1890s, there is a kind of political reaction against, and we saw that with Union Oil in Southern California as well. Right? There's a kind of political reaction against the powers of the trusts. These radical people's parties are for the most part local or regional in their impact. That is, there are some state legislatures, particularly in the Midwest, that where there is a significant number of state representatives, and even occasionally a majority can be grabbed by one of these radical parties, but they do not, largely because of their ideological diversity, right? Because they are so different with each other and because they're so rooted in local issues, they never develop into a national party. But the impact of this radical party, radical politics, is really felt in 1900 with the election of Teddy Roosevelt as the U.S. president. Roosevelt runs as a Republican, but he runs as a reformist within the Republican Party. That is to say, he campaigns on the idea that the Republican Party needs to be cleaned up of its corruption just as much as the Democrat Party. And so you want to think about progressivism under Roosevelt as a kind of mainstream, homogenized, nationalized version of all these highly local or regional radical people's parties. And the biggest issue that Roosevelt runs on is reining in the trust. So you see some of these campaign images, him claiming the label of the muckraker there in the image on the upper right. That's him raking in the muck, and these are all the different trusts and robber barons that he's going to control. In that central image, if you recall, that Standard Oil was thought of as the octopus, and the image of reptiles or snakes are commonly used. Well, there's the infant Hercules, right? Teddy Roosevelt wrestling in, I think that's John D. Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan, these two serpents. And even more kind of subtle is the image on the lower left, because you may be aware that Teddy Roosevelt was known as a great hunter and outdoorsman, and there he is taming the good trust, the bear, and the bad trust he had to shoot, right? So Roosevelt's going to serve 2 terms as a Republican. He'll be out for a term, and then he's going to run again as an independent under the Progressive Party label. And so we strongly associate the presidency of Teddy Roosevelt and the movement that he inspired as kind of the roots of the development of federal power. You may be aware of that term progressive as it's used in our current political culture. That's a word that we use to describe left-wing people, right? Sort of liberal Democrats. The progressives are sort of the most liberal wing of the Democrat Party. So there's a kind of irony here in Roosevelt originating that term and Roosevelt being a Republican. The most important thing that Roosevelt does during his presidency in regards to controlling the trust is to give teeth to the Sherman Antitrust Act. Now, the Sherman Act had been passed a decade before Roosevelt came to office, but had never been implemented against any of the trusts. Roosevelt is going to instruct his attorney general that he wants to see lawsuits starting to be filed against these combinations and these holding companies for combinations and restraint of trade. The suits, he's going to pick Standard Oil as kind of the premier icon, the premier emblem, the most infamous of all the trusts, and we're going to get a Supreme Court case. It won't come to a final decision until 1911 because, of course, it takes years to work its way through the courts, but it's Teddy Roosevelt that initiates the action against Standard Oil. Now, the Sherman Antitrust Act is a kind of tricky law. It has been in effect for well over a century, and the aggressiveness with which it is applied has dramatically varied from era to era. That is to say, different presidential administrations and really different phases of the American economy have brought out either very aggressive busting up, sort of phases of very aggressive busting up of combinations of monopolies, and other periods of American history, like the one we're living in right now, where the Sherman Act really has not been applied. And that's simply because the administration in charge has chosen not to go after the big companies. Now, as I say, it tends to go in eras. That is to say, both Republican and Democratic administrations tend to get very aggressive over decades in busting up trusts, or they tend to pull back and to be much more restrained in their use of the act. So the language of the Sherman Antitrust Act is here in the central figure. It says, every contract combination in the form of trust or otherwise, or conspiracy in restraint of trade or commerce among the several states or foreign nations is declared to be illegal. Now, what makes that so difficult is virtually every kind of business decision is in some way trying to gain an advantage over your competitors, right? For a great majority of the acts that might restrain trade or commerce, they're not conspiracies. They are the things that businesses are incentivized to do. Are we not supposed to be cutting our prices as much as we can to undercut our competitors and get a bigger market share? Isn't that doing the service of a free market and behaving that way? What is the moment at which, what is the specific behavior, or to what degree may different behaviors or tactics be carried out? Do they all of a sudden become a conspiracy? Do they all of a sudden become illicit and disadvantageous to the American economy? Much less actually violate the Constitution or violate the statute, right? And so the key rule that the Supreme Court articulated in Standard Oil versus the United States is called the rule of reason, right? And when it comes down to brass tacks, what it means is if you are forming a monopoly or combination, but it helps to promote trade, that is to say, it delivers products to consumers at a lower price and is more efficient, then that is an okay kind of combination. But monopolies or combinations that tend to restrain competition, right? Think back to our discussion about the crisis of capitalism and this paradox of free competition tends to produce monopoly, which is not free, right? And so the point here is we are embracing government regulation and control to the extent that that government regulation or control is necessary to maintain open competition. Right? That's the key principle that's articulated here in Standard Oil v. U.S. Now, the decision of the Supreme Court, which affirms the lower courts, is that Standard Oil is indeed a conspiracy that restrains trade, and therefore Standard Oil must break itself up into multiple independent companies. Now, this is quite an extraordinary moment in American constitutional history. There really is nothing that precedes this. Certainly there have been many court decisions, even Supreme Court decisions, that tell corporations no in a variety of ways, right? That decide against corporations. But never before in American history has the U.S. federal judiciary claimed the authority to be able to tell a company, you can't be a company. You've got to be a dozen companies, right? This is a brand new innovation. And if you think back to the history of American corporate law, from the beginning, the federal government was presumed to have no authority over corporations. The power to create corporations is not granted to the federal government in Article 1.8. And in terms of the federal judiciary, the key language of Article 3 that describes the judicial powers, the key paragraphs describe the types of law cases, the types of suits that the federal courts can hear, and they're essentially about suits that emerge out of different states. So, citizens of different states, between the citizens of one state and another state, between foreign residents and the citizens of a certain state, etc. Because Article 3 of the Federal Constitution uses those words citizens and states and doesn't use the word corporation. For a very long time, it was presumed that lawsuits involving corporations were not amenable to federal oversight, right, to the federal judiciary. So this is really a watershed moment in American constitutional history where in a couple of decades later, as I mentioned, we're going to have the FTC and the SEC and a variety of federal agencies that are going to kind of micro-regulate the structure of American corporations. But here in Standard Oil, we have this bold declaration by the federal judiciary that we can go in and muck around in your books, and if we don't like what we find, we can order you to end your existence as a company. It really is an extraordinary exercise of federal authority. So the structure of the American oil industry is dramatically different here at the end of Chapter 5 as America stands on the cusp of World War I, right? As we're going to enter into the next 3 or 4 decades in which America is going to become a great global power, the American oil industry is dramatically different. We refer to these kind of legacy companies as Standard's children. The most important of these, you'll be familiar with many of them, are Exxon and Mobil, who are going to be the descendants of Standard Oil of New Jersey and Standard Oil of New York, but also Amoco, Chevron, and a whole variety of others are the result of the Supreme Court busting up Standard Oil in 1911. Now, there's a great irony in this moment because the Supreme Court, just on the cusp of World War I, orders competition, right? Orders anti-monopoly policies. But as we enter the phase of the world wars and America becomes a global power and American companies are out competing with other states in the international context, competing for oil resources, it's going to become ever more important that they concentrate themselves in greater and greater sizes so that they can compete against the great oil companies of Britain and France that we'll discuss in the next sessions. So just at the moment that the United States politics and government policy is rallying behind and solidifying, we don't want major trusts, we want lots of independent companies, we're standing just on the cusp of a period in which there'll be tremendous economic incentive and government incentive, particularly to facilitate war supplies during first the World War and exponentially bigger oil supplies, at least for the United States in World War II, for those companies then to recombine. And so we're going to watch this theme all the way through the 20th century, these kind of phases in which there are economic incentives and government mandates both to bust up and then again to turn around and concentrate again. And you're going to get in this introductory section of the text is trying to introduce you to that theme. As we turn now in the next section, we're going to look at the global and international development of oil.